Welcome to Mormon Book Reviews, where an evangelical encounters the restoration. I am your host, Stephen Pynakker, and I am really honored and privileged to have these two guests on who collaborated in this very interesting book. It's a little outside of the comfort zone for MBR and probably maybe a little out of the comfort zone for you, but I think this is an important book, an important conversation. The name of the book is The Tornado's Daughter, the inspiring true story of Charlotte Gwalt, and it's written by Ted Turner. Ted, Charlotte, welcome to the program.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thanks for having us.
So, Ted reached out to me a few months ago and sent this copy of this book to me. And of course, authors, just so you know, I get books all the time in the mail. And if you want your book to get read by me and get booked on my program, you got to be persistent, like Ted was. And and I want to thank you. But what it was is my mom, she broke her hip, and she had asked me for some books just to read while to pass the time while she was in rehab. So one of the books I brought was this one. And you know what was so funny about it? This book appeared like I had forgotten about this book, and it just happened to be sitting on a table. Like I don't even remember setting it there. So I walk in, I see this, and I just pick it up, and I thought, oh, this might be a good book for my mom. So my mom read it and was very impressed with the story. And so then Ted and I started talking on the phone, and that's what caused us to have this interview because I finished the book yesterday, and it's really a story of an individual, Charlotte, and now who went through a very, very, very difficult childhood, suffered abuse, both emotional and sexual abuse and physical abuse. And Charlotte's story is a remarkable story, so much so that Ted wanted her story to get out there. So what's interesting is this book is written, it's Charlotte's voice, but Ted wrote it. Uh, Ted, what made you decide that you wanted to write this book?
Well, it was a little bit of a process for us. It kind of just came out of the blue. The easy answer is she asked me to. The longer answer is we've known each other, our families, for quite a while. And I had retired from my career, was deciding what to do next. We were together at a family function, and Charlotte asked, "Have you figured out what you're doing next?" I said, "No, I'll take some time to think about it." And she just kind of offhandedly, jokingly said, "Well, maybe you should write my memoirs." Now, having known each other for a while, I knew a little bit about her life. I had no idea what I was going to end up writing. But that was really the conversation. She said that, and there's people around. I think it was a kid. I think it was one of her grandchildren's birthday party. So there's noise and there's other stuff, and our whole conversation was probably a total of a minute. I think the only other thing she said was, if I was on a bus with seven people, we'd all have seven different versions of the bus trip. But I'd like mine to be heard. And so from that, you've read the intro,
Mhm.
right? Driving home that night, that intro kind of came to me. I wrote it down. I sent it to her an email. I said, "Look, I know you were joking, but I can't get this out of my head. What do you think?" And the next day, she calls me with tears in her eyes and said, "You heard me." So we
Mm.
had a number of conversations. Do you really want to tell your story? I've never written a book. Well, we might find out I can't write a book, you know. And so we had a series of conversations and finally decided, okay, let's write this book. Um, the funny thing is, it was slow going because every time we'd be together for something, instead of talking about it, neither of us would bring it up. She thought that her story's not really worth hearing, which, as you know, is ridiculous. And I thought, well, who am I to think I can write a book? So at some point, we finally said, okay, we can't tiptoe around anymore. If we're going to write a book, we're going to write a book. And so then we got serious about writing the book. But Stephen, it was just going to be something from me to her kids and grandkids so they could know grandma.
Mm.
That's all it originally was going to be for. And a few people read some drafts of it, and they all were universal in saying, no, 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 this is too important a story. It's you're telling it well. You need to get this out there to the world.
Mm.
And so that's where we are now. We've got a book. I reached out to you, and here we are.
Well, I think we should start with the title of the book, "The
Mhm.
Tornado's Daughter." Charlotte, you're the tornado's daughter. What does that mean?
And this is where I was really glad to trust Ted with my story because over and over again, each chapter I read, It was like he was there watching me throughout my life and describing my father and his temperament and comparing it to a tornado was was so precise. It was like he knew him. Though Ted's never met my father, you would think he had. My father is very unpredictable, and I couldn't have been more scared and terrified by him than I would be at a tornado coming my way. And he was very destructive. Just about every good thing in his life he destroyed.
Yeah, and this is really, I think, the introduction of the book kind of is your familial history,
Indeed.
your mother, and then how she met your father. Maybe talk a little bit about that background.
Well, um,
And by the way, just to make it really clear, so everybody understands, your father was a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So
yeah.
this is a Latter-day Saint story. I want to make sure that we get that out there too. So Charlotte, maybe talk about how your parents met and that background.
So my father was a soldier during the Vietnam War, and he was stationed in South Korea, and that's where he met my mother. And of course, I wasn't around to see all of this happen. So in the story, we try to be very fair and very honest, and we use phrases in the story like "the story goes," or "it's been said," or "so I've been told." Because all I have to go from are bits and pieces of what my parents talked about, what I've overheard as a child when it comes to how they met. But my mother was stunning. I think everybody who sees her falls in love with her. Ted got a minute to meet her, I think once or twice,
A
maybe.
couple times, yeah,
Yeah.
briefly.
And he can tell you everybody is smitten by her when they see her. Even now, she's in her 60s and she is beautiful. She moves with this grace that's enchanting. And um, and so it wasn't very hard, I think, for my father um, to fall head over heels for her. Um, she came from a powerful family. But then again, you have to understand the time and place this was. That's a little relative, but
Mhm.
where he was a very important man, my grandfather. Um, and so there was some danger in courting my mother. Um, but I think my grandfather was a very progressive man and understood the value of Western education and saw the um, opportunity for his children to go and live in America. So,
Yeah, yeah, and it's unusual too because when you think of South Korea at this time, they're still devastated from the war that happened with North Korea. There's a lot of poverty. There's a lot of people that have been displaced, which was
right,
happening to your mom and people, and people came from prominent families but lost their family, and then just all these horrible things. So this is a country in disarray still, even I mean, Korea really didn't become South Korea that we know until the 80s. I mean, it was a
right.
very, very backward place and it was still reeling from the devastation of the war. And then you have this tall white guy coming into these villages, giving candy out to the children, ingratiates himself, starts these tall tales that he was the son of a general. So in one sense, your family thought that he was this. Your mom and your grandfather thought he was this very prominent man. So your father was kind of a BSer, would you say,
Oh,
and
for
told
sure.
tales.
My his mom, my granny, used to say that um, Nick would rather climb a tree and lie to you than stand on the ground and tell the truth. And then another uncle told me, he says he would rather lie even if the truth sounded better. And so, yeah, he's a good storyteller. It's a gift that he's passed on to me. It makes me a good teacher. My grandkids, my children, and people that I've been assigned to teach. Um, they enjoy listening to me, and so you can use that talent for storytelling for good, and then you can use it to BS people.
Well, as Ted, I just wanted to ask you. So, as you're like Charlotte said that like you felt like you were part of this story all along, almost like observing this in real time. How was it you were able to put yourself in that place to be able? Because the book is written in such a way that you feel like Charlotte's telling the story, but it's you that's writing it. How are you able to accomplish putting everything in her voice? and her story, but you then also she feels like you nailed it in so many ways. Like you like it almost like you did meet her father. You did know these people in her life that you never met.
Yeah, well, that was the biggest challenge because that was very important to me to tell it in her voice. As she's often said, it's her story, it's my book, and that's true. There, in the book, there's literally maybe one sentence that's actually directly her words. But that was very important to me to get it right and to get it in her voice. And so I don't really have a clear answer for you as to how I did that. I feel like I was helped. I think I had some guidance beyond just my own abilities. But that was important. Two things were important. Telling it in her voice so that she felt heard, and that her story could be out there unfiltered by my bias or thoughts or experiences. And then getting it accurate was important too. And I think that helped. As she mentioned, especially early on in the book, you go further back in history, there are some things where so the story goes or so it's been told. But everything that I could corroborate with a document or a witness or a historical record, I went through the pains of doing that. And we had some conversations where we'd have an interview, and I'd follow up and say, "Okay, I don't understand how we got from here to here. What am I missing? What's the path? Either you've got the year wrong or I've got something wrong." And so I think all of that helped to understand her experience. We're telling some memories from some of it from when she's 5, 6, 9 years old. And you think about your own memories, you hear snippets of stories from aunts and uncles. So uh, we sometimes had to go back and say, okay, both of these stories could be right. Let's find the document or whatever it is that is the link, or let's figure out which one is most right. It would have been easy to tell a story that's best for the story, but I wanted to tell the story that's true. So I think that helped getting it into her voice. There are areas where I hope I've depicted the confusion or the strain that she was going through at certain times.
He did it so well that people, my friends who have known me for 20 years and more, say
Hmm.
that they can hear me in the book. And he not only did it, he do it so well, which I did not anticipate. But as I watched him write the story, I could see him suffer during the dark parts of the story.
Yeah, and just this, there are some very dark moments in this book. But this is a really, it's first of all, it's very well written. Second of
Thank you.
all, it's very powerful. I couldn't put it down. Like my mom said, she couldn't put it down. It's a remarkable story. And Charlotte, I think for a lot of people who would go through what you would go through, one would either say there's no God and just walk away from
Mm-hmm.
faith, um, or be in a very bad place where maybe they commit suicide or drug abuse or any number of things that could happen. And the fact that you're here having this conversation is a miracle. I mean, this is how remarkable of a story this is. And Charlotte, I just wanted to kind of talk, because I want people to buy the book, so we don't want to give them too much tell the whole story, but I want you to kind of tell the dynamic of your family. You have an older sister, your mom, your dad. You end up in some very bad places with your dad. Just talk about kind of the rough childhood you had.
So I think some of it became rough with the death of my brother, my mother's first child. I think there wasn't a desire for her to have any more children than the two living daughters that she had, but there was a disappointment in not having a son. And I was that last chance to have a son. I think that had an effect on what kind of mother she was to me. Um, and so I am the youngest of two daughters. And I think losing that son and not having a son also affected my father. He treated us like tomboys. He expected us to be boyish. He even gave us nicknames um, to that were boy names that he called us most of the time. That's how I was called Charlie. There was people until I was a married woman before some people realized that wasn't actually Charlie, was not actually my name. Um, and so my father was a blue collar worker most of his life. Sometimes he made really good money, sometimes he didn't. We really couldn't tell the difference because he was bad with money. So even when he had it, we went without things that were important because he managed money badly. Um, and, my mom, I think, was a good caregiver. She always made sure that our home was clean and that my sister and I were clean and that we knew how to keep things clean. Um, but I don't think that a caregiver and a parent are exactly the same thing. But she did care for us well and to make sure that, we ate well. Um, but the dynamics at home, like when it came to, I guess you could say the level of expectations for small children were high. I think they're typically higher for Asian cultures than they are for American cultures in the first place. And then my father being a military man, expectations for children's behavior were really high. And
Yeah.
failure to meet those expectations resulted in severe punishment. Um, there was a Korean tradition in our home, in the fact that we lived more like a Korean family, I think, than an American family. Um, when it came to certain expectations of respect that the younger daughter was to give the older daughter, it was more traditionally Korean than it is American. For example, in Korea, younger children don't even call their older siblings by their name.
Hmm.
It would be disrespectful. And so there was a lot of what a lot of people would call favoritism for my older sister. And so my American grandparents saw this, and I think they did what they could to compensate for that a lot. And I even say in the book that that's where I felt the most love, and that's when I typically think of who my parents were. Not my mother and father, but my parents, the people who taught me why I should be good, and why I should use good manners, and why I should be grateful. Not just that I should, but the people who were my parents were my grandmother and my grandfather. And so I think they played the largest role in my life on um, probably up until my 11 or 12 years old. And then attending church, my church leaders became my parents as well. I decided a long time ago, there's a church song called I Am a Child of God. And it goes, I'm a child of God, and he has sent me here, has given me an earthly home with parents kind and dear. And it used to make me so mad to sing that song. And it wasn't until even just recently, I'm a grandmother now, that I've realized your parents are not necessarily who you were born to, but who teaches you about God. Those are your parents. And I did have parents who were kind and dear and did teach me about morality and about dignity. And I decided a long time ago that your family isn't necessarily who you're blood related to, but who you're willing to bleed for. The more we're willing to bleed for, the more like the Savior we become who bled for us all. And so when I think of my family dynamic, I think more of those people that God's put in my life um, to be my parents. Ultimately, they would be the ones to help me run away from the people I was born to.
I have to say, I was reading through this book, and there would be times I'd just be like, what's going to happen next? Like,
Mm,
what shoe is going to drop? I mean, this story just constantly, one thing after another. You think it couldn't get any worse, and it just gets worse and worse and worse. And just the abuse that you suffered from your father, he had this short temper, and he would beat
mm,
you and your sister. And then once you both started getting older, there was this basically what happened was your parents got divorced, your mom and dad, and
mm-hmm.
you and your sister were left with your dad. Maybe explain why all that happened.
Well, I would have to ask my mom, which I never have. We don't, oddly, my sister and my mom, we don't ever talk about what happened, ever, ever. Um, and my mom and my sister and we have kind of a pass the salt relationship. It's very shallow, and we're polite and civil. We don't argue, but we don't ever say anything important either. And but if I had to guess why that was, why my sister and I were left with my father, I think it was a cultural thing in Korea. My understanding is that when women leave their husbands, the husbands keep the children. Um, and I don't think my mother knew that she had the power and the ability to take my sister and I with her. Um, and so, but if you asked me, would she have wanted to? I don't know. I don't know that she would have wanted that responsibility of being a single mother.
Well,
Um,
Stephen, we actually we did go into some of the detail in the book here. I think, forgive me if I'm jumping in and I've got it wrong, but
no, no.
I
Go ahead.
think Stephen, your question goes to that particular point when they got abandoned, and with some Korean family moving in, this dynamic that Charlotte has talked about, these were her aunts and uncles, and initially she and her sister were very excited to meet more of the family, be around them, but quickly found out that they were looked at as servants, as unimportant. And her father's violence had kind of been in check since the house was now full of people. And so, being young and not liking being treated as servants in their own home and all the noise and confusion and people around and being so unimportant in their minds, they said, Mom, we'd rather live with Dad when they
Mhm.
actually
We
split.
did.
And so, to Charlotte's point earlier about her being more of a caretaker than a parent, her response was, "Don't call me mom," because that was it. You want to go live with dad? Fine. That's it. That's your new reality. Uh, and so they got left with dad, and nobody really checked in on them. And that's when the abuse came back with a
Yes. And
vengeance.
so both of you are now older, and you had basically your father started molesting your older sister.
Yeah, I think some of that had to do with, she was 2 years older, mature, more mature than I was, more womanly, even though she was still very young, not a woman. And she looks more like my mother than I do. And I think that played a role because not only did my father love my mother, probably, but for sure he was obsessed with her. Um, I'm not too sure if you can be obsessed with someone you love. I don't know if those things, two things, can exist in the same space. I don't know, but for sure, my father was just obsessed with her till the day he died. He never remarried, um, nor did he ever have another relationship with another woman. No, that I'm aware of. Um, he might have had flings, or I don't know what that was like, but I know that he was never in a committed relationship ever again.
So then basically what happens is eventually your older sister ends up moving in with your mom and right? Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes. And then so you're left alone with your dad. So now you're left to fend for yourself. And what happens is at this point, what are you in the living in the trailer park right by the fire station? Or is that
No, no, not
okay?
yet.
Okay.
So when my sister left, my mother never came for me. Um, well, kind of she did. So, but I'm not too sure why she didn't fight for me. So I don't know why she didn't think that when I was asked if I wanted to go live with her, as an adult and as a mother, there's no way I could look back on that moment and for her not to suspect I was being coerced by my father. But my mother came for my sister, and my sister, see, she was 12, so I was 10 years old when they came for my sister. And we lived in a little apartment. And it's going to be, let's see, 2 more years.
But 13's by the time you moved into the trailer
Yeah.
park. Yeah.
So I'm just barely 13 when I moved in the trailer park. So maybe 2.5 years later.
Okay. And so this is now you're a teenager, you're starting to make friends in the park, and this is when you start older men start coming into your life.
Well, there weren't any other teenagers in the park. Most of the people there were low income young adults. And there was one family that lived there that had small children. And and I liked spending time with those small children. She had two little girls and a little boy, and she often asked me to watch the children, and I liked being around them. And I didn't. She didn't pay me anything to watch them, but she didn't have to. And so I befriended this young mother, and then she had a couple of other girls that that I became friends with, and we spent a little time. I thought I was cool. They treated me like an equal, and it was the first time I think an adult had treated me more as a person than a child, or someone who didn't want to be bothered by me. So yeah, I guess you could say I made some friends. They weren't very good friends. They were terrible influence, and I think looking back, I still can't even tell you if everything that their role in the abuse was intentional or if it happened spontaneously and they just were opportunists. I don't know.
Yeah, it's hard to piece back all this together. So now you are in a situation in which, and we don't have to get into too many details, but basically there's a succession of some men that come into your life, and you lose your
Yeah,
virginity in a very ugly way, and just to go through what you were going through at the age of 13. I mean, when I look at 13-year-olds now, I mean, they're children, and
sure.
you didn't
Sure.
look at yourself necessarily as a child. Like a lot of 13-year-olds think, well, I'm a big kid, or I'm an adult or
Right.
an adult. You
Right.
don't
You
think of
feel
yourself
like
as
it.
being a child.
There's a photo in the book that I purposely, one of the ones I chose is that she's 13 years old in the photo. And you look at that photo and think about what happened to her, and there is no way these men didn't know what they were doing was evil.
Yeah.
And these women that had befriended me, they introduced me to every single man who abused me.
There, there
Yeah.
you are,
My
just a
little
kid.
school picture in eighth grade.
Yeah. So yeah, and just folks know, in case I haven't brought this up earlier, this all takes place in whereabouts in Texas? Where's this all happening?
Greater Houston area,
Greater Houston area.
Channel
Okay.
Baytown, Pasadena.
Yep. So I wanted to ask you, so at this point you have these men, you get sexually abused, you're going to hide this from your father, and then you get pregnant.
Right, right. And so I think that's the question I get more than anything else is um, why didn't I why didn't I ask for help? And oh man, I have trouble talking about this, but I'm the one that's bringing it up. So um, the first time that I've been victimized by one of these men, he was a volunteer fireman who worked at or who volunteered at the fire station that was across the street from the trailer park where I lived. And when that happened, I did not know anything about um, like how a child is. I knew you had to have sex to conceive a child, but I thought that was a one and done. That if you do that, you've conceived. And so I expected that I was pregnant at that point immediately after. And I there was a conversation that happened when my sister was still living at home, and I was, let's see, 11 ish. It was maybe 10. I can't quite remember. She was in high school, so she had to have been a freshman in high school, and I was 12 years old. So when she was 12 and or she was 14 and I was 12, we were sitting down at the table having dinner. We were having spaghetti with red Kool-Aid. And she says, there's a girl at school who's going to have a baby. And my father took a deep breath and he put his fork down on his plate. He placed his hands on the table and he leaned back in his chair. And he says this awful thing that I promised myself I will never say out loud again. But he makes this terrible threat that if that ever happens to either one of us, that he would do this terrible thing. And so there was no way I was going to tell my father that I had been assaulted and that I thought I was pregnant. There was no thing. I thought that was going to be the end of me. I literally thought that I was going to be found in a ditch somewhere. And so finding out that it took some time, I just stewed over that until I realized I wasn't pregnant. And then I started asking questions, my older girl cousins, other girls at school, and kind of figured I learned some things about the birds and the bees, and realized that that I may not have been pregnant because of it, and so um, but yeah, that was the first thing. And most of these times with these men, there was only ever one encounter, um, until I stopped being innocent.
Hmm.
So
So at
there.
this point, you would have said you would consider yourself maybe promiscuous or something. Is that how would you
No, not that it
characterize
was
it?
promiscuous. What happened was, eventually there was one of these abusers.
Oh,
And once was abused, I avoided that person.
yeah.
There, like I said, there was only ever one encounter. I never let myself go around to that person if I could avoid it, when I was trapped. And then later, there are some instances where I don't know how I was in the situation I got into. There's no memory of me getting into
Right.
someone's car. There's no memory of me being willingly with this person. And then as things
Yeah.
progressed, there was a one who I felt a little guilty about what he had done.
Okay.
And after it was over, he asked me if I was hungry, and I said yes. So he drove me to Taco Bell and he got me something to eat. And to my shame, even in that moment, I was grateful. I was grateful to have been fed. And so later, um, when some time had passed, I knew where he lived. He lived down the street in another trailer park. I was hungry again, and I knew where to find him. And
Okay.
so I went back, just like a stray animal, wanting to be fed. And that is when I quit being innocent. Not that I was promiscuous, but
Yeah.
I knew my value to this person, and that I could leverage my value to get something that I needed or wanted. And and then the last person would be, the one who would father a child on me. And do you want to call that a relationship? I mean, usually that's something. So when that when Jody's father came around, he I knew exactly what he wanted. I wasn't kidding myself, and that was the first time where, from the very beginning, I allowed it all to happen because I wanted to leverage something that I wanted, and I wanted him to get me out of that house. I wanted him to take me away. I don't know why my teenage brain, I was a stupid kid, but I thought, oh yeah, he's gonna run away with me and we'll live happily ever after. Kidnapping charges, what are those? I don't know what those
Right.
are.
Yeah.
And all of these were men. They were not teenage boys. All of them were in their 20s or more. Some of them closer to 30.
Stephen, if I could interject here, because this is one of the areas where a number of women who've read the book have come up to me
Mm.
and been grateful that Charlotte shared this part of it. I think this is important in helping people. She talks about losing innocence, right? She's now been exposed to this. She knows that she can manipulate these guys into getting her food, or there's no toilet paper, just the necessities of life in the trailer. And so for many, many years, she struggled with feeling guilt over those actions. Can I really call myself a victim kind of thing? And so a lot of victims, survivors of abuse go through that. They put the blame on themselves and over silly little things. This was survival in many instances for her. We haven't touched on it yet, but with her father, there was abject poverty in times of homelessness. And so a taco can look a lot like love. And so this ability to forgive oneself and really remove the blame that doesn't belong on the victim is a powerful message of this book. And Charlotte talks about learning the difference. She mentioned value, the difference between value and worth. And I don't know if you want to share that, Charlotte, or are you do you
Sure.
need a minute to recover? Or
Sure. No, no. And you're absolutely right. There was a lot of guilt, for, but also because even before I started leveraging myself for things that I wanted, or needed, there was also this time where I felt like I was my first line of defense. If I hadn't been out hanging out with these adult girlfriends of mine, sneaking out of the house while my dad was working a graveyard shift, um, if I hadn't been in the wrong place at the wrong time, I was my first line of defense to keep myself safe. So I felt a lot of guilt when it came to those, even that very first rape. I was someplace where I should not have been, and I knew it. And a lot of women, I think, start blaming themselves because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. They were at a party, they allowed themselves to become intoxicated, or whatever that is. Women, I think, hold this guilt, but the value and worth, that is, if you look them up in the dictionary, they mean the same thing. But I need two words to describe two different things. And value is what I felt while I was being abused. I knew these men thought about me all day long and that I was important to them, and they could not wait to see me again. And I knew how important I was to them, and I felt value. And as a matter of fact, when I was rescued, I felt that value diminish. And I even wanted to go back to it so that I could feel valued again. That my young women's leader, our young women's president in the congregation that I lived in, she told me that I was confusing two things. I was confusing value with worth. And that value is what those men had for me. But my worth was something that came from God. And that if I would seek it out, I would find him. And that it could never change. It could never diminish. And it took a long time. In the book, you'll read that that path was sometimes difficult, but I did find my worth. And it was the compass, I guess you could say, as to why I didn't use drugs or I didn't abuse alcohol, or the choices that I eventually made as a young woman, as a mother, as a wife, came from understanding what my worth was over what value is.
Yeah, I think that's a real important message in the book. And, just to go over, like, during this whole period of time, you're going from school to school constantly, being moved and upheaval, but you're still getting good grades in school.
I tried.
All things considered, it's a miracle that you were able to, and then also avoid alcohol and drugs. And, I mean, there were so many traps you could have fallen into, and you didn't. And in many ways, it was your parents, if you will, that were helpful in your faith journey.
It's true. So my father, it's a combination, I think, of wanting to isolate me and my sister, because she did a lot of school hopping when she still lived with us as well. We were doing a lot of that. But I think it was a combination of my father just not being able to provide a consistent place to live, um, and him wanting to isolate us. It was a very lonely way to be, because I didn't have very many friends. And but I'm not too sure. And this is why I believe, this is why I have a testimony that God is my father, and that he loves me, and that his son is my savior, and that there are angels all around. Because I remember thinking to myself through this that I was a daughter of God. And I remember, um, in the book, you'll read that there are these tender mercies, as small as they seem. Um, they were important to me, and they were things um, that were not gone unnoticed by me, where I saw his hand in my life. And from a very, very young age, I had a very real relationship with my Heavenly Father. I thought about him all the time, and I never stopped thinking about what he thought of me. And most of the time, I always felt like he loved me, and that I was worth a great deal to him. So drugs were never a temptation. Alcohol was never a temptation. Abusing others were never a temptation for me.
You know, you this I mean, folks, that you really have it's very difficult to describe this book because it's so unique and such a unique story and then the way that it's told. And I just think that's so important to actually, folks, read this book because it's a remarkable story. I think the way that it's come together, Ted, I would have to say that, yeah, there has to be some kind of divine hand on this whole thing because, I mean, this is, we just are just talking about your childhood, but I mean, you end up getting married at the age of what, 15 or 16?
I'm 15 when I get married.
From a, and he was 19 and a Latter-day Saint, and you have five kids by the time you're 20. I mean,
21. I was 21
21.
when I had my last child.
And so just to have all this happen in this short period of time from basically from being a child in going into young adulthood, you've lived a full life of trauma and drama and so much that it's a remarkable that just the early part of your life in and of itself is remarkable that you got through that.
Well,
What's remarkable is she didn't just get through it, is she
She's
thrived.
yes,
That to me is the amazing thing.
that's so
We've talked
true.
about all the darkness, and there's some dark
Yes.
themes in this book. But somebody said to me, and I wish I had thought of this. Somebody said to me, as I'm reading this book, it dawned on me, I'm not reading the story of somebody's trials. I'm reading the
Yes.
story of somebody's triumphs.
And
And I
I
thought
think,
that's it. How do you go through the worst garbage life can throw you,
yeah,
still maintain your worth, find a way to thrive, not lose sight of the path to happiness, right? And as you know, it's even after she marries, the road is not smooth. You know,
no.
you want to know how to raise kids, okay, read the book. You want to know how to get through trauma, read the book. You want to know how to salvage a marriage, read the book. You want to, it's just it's an amazing story because she's an amazing person.
And in Charlotte, you are a remarkable person, but even with everything, you still had kids that had problems and issues, and
yeah.
you have your oldest child was taken away from you, and then I mean, just and then he didn't even find out that you were his mother until he was the age of 12. And
He found out he was adopted when he was 12, but I think he was a little bit older than that when he found out that
okay,
who he thought was his sister was his mother.
okay, so just. And this just I mean it's remarkable, but I think yeah that's what my mom even when she read this book she was like she's a remarkable person to have been able to get through this. It really is a powerful story. And she said just an amazing role that your faith played, but also talks about your, I've experienced some trauma and I have a pastor friend who's experienced some trauma. And sometimes he said that there's this inner fortitude that when you go through difficult times, it actually gives you tools to be able to deal with issues in life. Like for some people, if they have something, they could have a perfect life, and then something bad happens to them when they're in 30s, and it just they can't handle it because
Yeah,
they never experienced these things. So actually, and I've told people, I said, a lot of the PTSD and trauma that I've experienced in my past has actually given me the tools to deal with current things in my life that might be difficult. Maybe speak to that.
sure. And I talk about that. Um, the question that's asked: Why does God allow terrible things to happen to good people? And the truth of it is I think that it's part of our education. Latter Day Saints, and including me, I believe that I was a spirit before I came to the earth, before I received a mortal body, and um, and my son-in-law asked me this question: Why does God let terrible things happen to good people? And I said, well, do you think when we were all in heaven before we came to earth, God was like, hey, guys, line up. It's mystery life or outer darkness. What do you want? And he goes, no, I don't think that's the way it was. And I said, okay, maybe it went this way. Charlotte, it's your turn. You're going to have all these terrible things happen to you, or you can go and be in outer darkness with the rest of Satan and his followers. And I'm like, nope, I don't think that's the way it happened. My son-in-law says, I don't think it's the way it happened either. And I said, I think it happened something like this. I think Heavenly Father and probably my Savior Jesus Christ sat down with me and they said, Charlotte, what kind of woman do you want to become? And knowing myself and how romantic I am, I decided I wanted to be forgiving and compassionate and brave and all the things that I felt like a savior would be as well. I wanted to be just like him. And maybe they smiled at me very sadly and said, "You realize if you're going to be forgiving, you will have to be offended. And if you're going to be compassionate, you will need to know something about suffering." And I agreed to that. And when I came to this earth, they kept their promise and secured an education through experience and trial that would help me become something remarkable, a queen in the making.
Mm.
And so many people who go through these trials and experiences may not realize the blessing that's hidden there, which are opportunities to become something remarkable. And then in turn to help others along their way. That's the purpose for me telling this story, is in the hopes that my experiences and the things that I've learned will help others, uh, not just my own children, but anybody I come into contact. I'm sure those that share similar trauma that you've experienced, you're able to help them overcome it. And that's where we become partners with the Savior, and in helping people overcome their trials. And it's what also will make us family.
Mm. Yeah, and that's really how the unique theology of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints really has been very vital for you to kind of sort this thing out and get a better understanding
Sure.
of like the greater purpose of what you think is going on here. And this there's so many curveballs that are thrown at you in this book. There's what in the evangelical world we would refer to as spiritual warfare, where you're dealing with basically a demonic entity as well, the voodoo lady.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
that kind of stuff, and that was another interesting segment. So there's so much going on here. You are dealing with a spiritual battle in many ways throughout your life.
One that will always continue. I almost did not write or tell this story. Ted wrote the book, but I almost didn't agree. Um, because as we began the interviews in the very beginning of writing the book, as you might imagine, things that I've been trying to forget for 30 years um, started to have an effect on me again. I started to have night terrors again. I started to become very paranoid again. It was hard for me to sleep or to be in vulnerable positions like taking a shower. I would have terrible anxiety just taking a shower because that was a place where I was vulnerable as a girl and I would get preyed upon. And so I, during this process, I try to lose some weight. And so sometimes when you're hungry and you feel that humiliation come over you, where you remember watching people eating food, secretly hoping that they will offer you some. And then when they do, trying not to gobble it up. You start remembering all of that trauma. And as I was going through all of that, I started to get frustrated with myself. I thought myself stronger than I was. I was like, why does this still bother me after all of these years? And my son in law, Taylor, said, "Mom, it's because it was hard." And that was the strength that gave me, knowing that it's okay for it to be hard. It's okay for it to still bother you, and you can still be happy. More than anything else, as I've reached out to people when I want to try to help someone who's been through trauma, they assume that somehow my trials were minimal because I was able to get over them, and that they can't possibly get over theirs because theirs are so terribly hard. And that saddens me more than anything I can think of. The truth is yes, they are hard. And no matter how hard they are, there is still happiness waiting for you. and don't give up on yourself. I thought that in order to be happy, I would have to get over these things. But if I could, they must not have been that hard. And that's just a lie. I think that's one of the lies that the devil tries to sell us so that we stay stuck in this misery. The truth is, it is hard and it will probably bother you for the rest of your life, but you can be happy.
Mm. Wow. Well, Ted, you had never written a book like this before. And honestly, it's your writing, but it's her voice. I feel like Charlotte was talking to me while
Good.
reading this book. I
My
think,
my approach, I wanted this to feel when people read the book that they're not reading somebody's story, but they're sitting in the living room with Charlotte and she's having a conversation with them.
well, I think Charlotte's voice is definitely very much heard in this, and I really appreciate you coming on to tell your story. Now, just so everybody knows, all the names basically in this book have been changed, so just to protect people and stuff like that, and just some of the issues. But it's all true. These are all true stories that Charlotte has experienced. Nothing's been conflated or anything like that, and so I think it's an authentic autobiography, if you will, in one sense. Even and Ted, I want to just honor you for taking the time to you're a very busy man, and you to take the time to write a book like this. I think really just says so much about your relationship with Charlotte and her family and your familial connections to each other. This must have been for you on your spiritual journey. Do you feel like this helped enhance your spiritual walk, writing this book?
It was a very emotional process. And so, we strengthen our faith often by sharing faith with others and those, faith promoting stories, so to speak. And so I think my faith, my testimony in the Savior has always been pretty strong, but hearing the details of what she's gone through. And she has shared some areas in there where members of the church and even leadership in the church were not too Christ-like. Some were wonderful, some were not. And so these are things that people face all the time, loved ones that I have that kind of can shake some people and others it makes them stronger. So yes, it was reaffirming of the things that I already believe, of our worth, our indestructible worth in the eyes of our Creator. The fact that the church is made up of people and people do squirrely things doesn't make the church untrue, doesn't make God a hypocrite, doesn't do any of those things. So it was an emotionally arduous journey. It was a labor of love, and I feel very privileged that she trusted me to tell her story.
Yeah, it was great. And Charlotte, I just want to say, I we didn't haven't really talked much about your husband, but your husband is a very prominent person in this book, and you had a really bumpy ride there in the early days
Mm.
of your marriage.
He
But
was a frog, and it took a lot of kissing to get a prince out of him.
but you do have a prince of a husband, and
We
and
do.
that really having that relationship must be so wonderful that you have a lovely relationship with your husband. You got children, grandchildren. And so in many ways you have succeeded and thrived, like Ted said, in so many ways. That's really awesome and inspiring. Charlotte, I just wanted to wrap this up with you and just ask you if you had any final words you would like to share with the audience.
Well, I'm grateful for the opportunity that you've given me to speak to so many. Um, and, you know, actually, the things that I wanted to say the most were about value and worth, about why our Heavenly Father gives us such hard things in our life sometimes. Those are the most important messages that I wanted to convey to others. Um, I think that if I think I'd like to say how grateful I am to Ted. He had to, in a very small measure, live the terror um, and the darkness that I went through in order to tell the story with my voice. And so I'm grateful to him and his wife and the support that they've been. Um, I'm grateful for the angels in human clothing that were in my life. I will love them forever for the people who risked much to help me. And and yeah, I think I know that God loves me because He gave me Jacob.
Mm.
Um, every day, I've been glad that I've chosen him. And so those people are the people that this story was originally told for. I never, when we began, never would have imagined that it would be shared with anybody outside of that circle. Um, it's hard to share it, but if it helps just one person, it will be worth it. Um, when I sign an autograph for the book, I always sign it with much love. The story is given with much love to everyone who reads it.
That's great. So the book is The Tornado's Daughter, written by Ted Turner, the story of Charlotte. And I think it's a really um, wonderful book and beautiful in its own way. Even through all the darkness that you went through, there was always that light there. And we can see that light shine throughout the book. Folks, we're going to have links in the description for those of you who'd like to purchase this book. And Ted, if you could send me your preferred links of how you want me to put this in the description so that they can purchase it. It is published by Covenant Books, which is a Christian book publisher. And it was really a great honor to have both of you on the program today. Ted and Charlotte, thanks for coming on today.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Stephen. Appreciate it.
So we'll have links in the description there to purchase the book. Also, for those of you who'd like to financially support the channel, we'll have links in the description as well. Couldn't do it without you. For those of you who are financially supporting the channel, it is greatly appreciated. And remember, the most important thing is this: all the voices of the restoration will be heard here on Mormon Book Reviews.